The first body was discovered on a Tuesday morning at 6:43, which was unusual only because Sharon Mitchell never deviated from her routine. She woke at 6:15, made coffee, walked her golden retriever Max around the block, returned home, showered, dressed, and left for work at 7:30. The mailman found her when he noticed the front door was open. Max was sitting in the hallway, still on his leash, staring at the kitchen. Inside, Sharon Mitchell sat at her small breakfast table, a cup of coffee in front of her, her phone face down beside it, her reading glasses folded neatly to the left of a folded newspaper. The newspaper was open to the crossword puzzle. 3 words were filled in. Everything looked completely normal except that Sharon Mitchell was dead. Detective Sarah Chun arrived at the scene at 7:21. She had been with the department for 9 years, working homicide for the last 4, and she understood immediately that something about this scene was wrong. Not wrong in the obvious sense. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture or broken windows. Wrong in a deeper way, a way she could not articulate. The responding officers had secured the scene but seemed uncertain about what they were securing. One of them, a young patrolman named Torres, kept looking at the coffee cup. It was strange, he told Chin, that the coffee was still warm. The medical examiner estimated time of death between 5:30 and 6 in the morning, which meant Sharon Mitchell had been dead for nearly 2 hours, but the coffee in that cup was barely lukewarm, as if it had been poured only 30 or 40 minutes earlier. Chun photographed everything. The kitchen table, exactly centered beneath the overhead light. The chair, positioned at a precise 90-degree angle to the table. The newspaper, folded to expose the crossword. 3 answers filled in with Sharon's distinctive handwriting. The pen placed parallel to the right edge of the paper. The reading glasses, temples facing inward. The phone, face down, charging cable neatly coiled beside it. The coffee cup, handle pointing to the right. Chun noted the brand of coffee, the temperature of the liquid, the exact distance from the cup to the edge of the table, measured with a ruler from her kit. She measured everything. The position of the chair from the wall, the angle of Sharon's hands, folded in her lap, the way her head was tilted slightly forward, chin almost touching her chest, eyes closed. It looked like she had fallen asleep reading the crossword. Except she was not asleep. There were no visible marks on her body, no signs of poisoning that the medical examiner could detect without a full autopsy. No evidence of anything except a woman sitting at her breakfast table who had simply stopped living. The autopsy revealed nothing conclusive. No drugs in her system beyond her regular blood pressure medication. No trauma, no heart attack, no stroke, no aneurysm. The toxicology report came back clean. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined, which meant the case would likely go cold, filed away with all the other medical mysteries that occasionally happen to otherwise healthy people. But Chun could not let it go. She reviewed the scene photographs every night, studying the arrangement of objects on that kitchen table. 2 weeks later, the second body was discovered. Marcus Webb, 47, accountant, lived alone in a downtown apartment. His neighbor reported a smell, and when building maintenance opened the door, they found Marcus sitting in his living room recliner, television remote in his right hand, a half-empty beer on the side table, reading glasses on, a financial magazine open across his lap. The television was on, paused on a documentary about World War II. Everything looked normal except Marcus Webb had been dead for approximately 72 hours. Chun was called to the scene. She stood in the doorway of that living room and felt her stomach drop. The recliner was positioned exactly in front of the television. The remote was in Marcus's right hand, thumb resting on the pause button. The beer was on the side table, condensation ring perfectly circular, no spillage. The magazine was open to page 34, an article about tax optimization strategies. His reading glasses were the exact model he always wore. The television showed a documentary paused at 23 minutes and 41 seconds. Chun photographed everything. She measured the distance from the recliner to the television, the angle of Marcus's head against the headrest, the position of his feet on the footrest. She noted that his shoes were still on, laces tied, no scuff marks. She examined the beer bottle, noting the brand, the amount of liquid remaining, the exact position on the side table. Marcus's neighbor confirmed that this was how Marcus spent most evenings. He would come home from work around 6, change into casual clothes but leave his shoes on, grab a beer from the refrigerator, settle into his recliner, and watch documentaries until around 10, when he would go to bed. The scene was a perfect recreation of an ordinary Thursday evening in the life of Marcus Webb. Except Marcus Webb was dead and no one could explain why. The autopsy showed the same results as Sharon Mitchell. No drugs, no trauma, no medical explanation. Cause of death, undetermined. Chun requested a meeting with the medical examiner, Dr. Raymond Park, who had performed both autopsies. They met in his office, surrounded by filing cabinets and the faint smell of disinfectant. Dr. Park was in his 60s, methodical, not given to speculation, but even he seemed unsettled. He told Chun that in 30 years of forensic pathology, he had never seen 2 cases like this. Healthy adults do not simply die without cause, he said, not twice in 2 weeks in the same city. There had to be something they were missing. A toxin that did not show up on standard tests, a rare medical condition, something. Chun asked him about the scenes themselves, whether he noticed anything unusual about how the bodies were positioned. Dr. Park paused, stared at his desk, then said something that stayed with Chun. He said the bodies looked comfortable, like they had been arranged by someone who cared about them, who wanted them to look peaceful, to look normal. Like someone had taken great care to make death look like life. Chun began to build a file. She requested access to both victims' financial records, phone records, social media accounts, work histories, medical histories. She interviewed family members, friends, co-workers. She was looking for connections, overlaps, anything that might link Sharon Mitchell and Marcus Webb. But there was nothing. They lived in different neighborhoods, worked in different industries, had no mutual friends, no shared interests, no common locations they frequented. They were strangers who happened to die in the same city within 2 weeks of each other under identical mysterious circumstances. Except they were not identical, Chun realized. They were similar. Both victims died in familiar settings, engaged in routine activities, surrounded by objects arranged exactly as they would have arranged them. Sharon at her breakfast table with her crossword. Marcus in his recliner with his documentary. The scenes were not random. They were precise, intentional, a recreation of normalcy. 3 weeks later, the third body was found. Elena Rodriguez, 32, elementary school teacher, discovered in her home office on a Saturday morning by her sister who had come to take her to brunch. Elena was sitting at her desk, laptop open, hands on the keyboard, eyes closed, head tilted slightly as if she were deep in thought. On the screen was a document, lesson plans for the upcoming week. A red pen sat beside a stack of graded homework papers. A cup of tea, chamomile, was on a coaster to her left. A framed photograph of her parents was angled so she could see it while working. Everything was exactly as Elena's sister described her usual Saturday morning routine. Elena woke early on Saturdays, made tea, sat at her desk, and worked on lesson plans for 2 or 3 hours before meeting friends or family for brunch. She was disciplined, organized, consistent, and now she was dead. Chun arrived at the scene and knew immediately that this was the same killer. The precision was identical, the care in arrangement, the recreation of routine. She photographed the desk, measured the distance from the laptop to the edge of the desk surface, noted the exact position of the teacup, the pen, the papers. Elena Rodriguez had no connection to Sharon Mitchell or Marcus Webb. Different age, different career, different social circle. But the pattern was becoming clear. The killer was not choosing victims based on who they were. The killer was choosing them based on what they did, how they lived, the routines that defined their daily existence. Chun called a press conference. She stood in front of reporters and cameras and told the public that 3 people had died under unusual circumstances, that the deaths were being investigated as potential homicides, that anyone with information should contact the police. She did not mention the pattern, the precision, the recreation of routine. She did not want to cause panic, but she also did not want the killer to know that she understood what was happening. The department assigned additional detectives to the case. Chan worked with Detective James Rourke, a veteran investigator known for his ability to see patterns others missed. Rourke reviewed the case files, studied the photographs, visited each scene. He agreed with Chen's assessment. These were not natural deaths. These were murders carefully planned and meticulously executed. But the question remained, how was the killer doing it, and more importantly, why? Chun and Rourke began to investigate the routines themselves. They interviewed neighbors, co-workers, family members, anyone who knew the victims well enough to describe their daily patterns. Sharon Mitchell woke at 6:15 every morning, never varied. Marcus Webb watched documentaries every Thursday evening, same chair, same beer, same routine. Elena Rodriguez worked on lesson plans every Saturday morning, same desk, same tea, same discipline. The routines were known, observable, predictable, which meant the killer had been watching. Chun requested surveillance footage from nearby businesses and residences. She found Marcus Webb on camera walking home from work every evening at the same time, same route. She found Elena Rodriguez at a coffee shop every Saturday morning before returning home to work. She found evidence that someone could have been watching, learning, documenting these patterns. But she could not find the watcher. Rourke suggested they look at the objects in each scene. The coffee cup, the beer bottle, the tea. He wondered if the killer had somehow poisoned the drinks with something that metabolized quickly, leaving no trace. They sent samples to an independent lab for advanced testing. The results came back negative. No poisons, no toxins, no foreign substances. Chun considered other possibilities. Carbon monoxide, but the detectors in each home were functioning. Electrical shock, but there were no burns or marks. Suffocation, but there were no signs of struggle or petechial hemorrhaging. Every avenue led nowhere. The fourth victim was found on a Wednesday afternoon. Thomas Chun, no relation to Detective Sarah Chun, 61 years old, retired postal worker. He was discovered by his daughter, who stopped by for a weekly visit. Thomas was sitting in his garage workshop, wearing his safety glasses, holding a piece of sandpaper, working on a birdhouse. The radio was tuned to a classical music station. His workbench was organized, tools arranged by size. A measuring tape was extended exactly 6 inches. Everything suggested a man engaged in his favorite hobby, except Thomas Chun was dead, and the birdhouse he had been sanding was finished, perfectly smooth, ready for painting. Chun and Rourke stood in that garage and understood that the killer was accelerating. For victims in 2 months, the pattern was consistent, the precision unwavering. But now there was a new detail. The birdhouse was finished. Sharon Mitchell's crossword had 3 words filled in: unfinished. Marcus Webb's documentary was paused: unfinished. Elena Rodriguez's lesson plans were partially complete: unfinished. But Thomas Chen's birdhouse was done. Chun took photographs, measurements, notes. She studied the workbench, the tools, the arrangement. She interviewed Thomas's daughter, who confirmed that her father spent every Wednesday afternoon in his garage, working on woodworking projects, listening to classical music. He was methodical, patient, always finished what he started. The birdhouse should not have been finished. The medical examiner confirmed what Chun already knew. No cause of death, no trauma, no toxins, no explanation. Thomas Chun was a healthy 61-year-old man who should have lived another 20 years. But instead he was dead in his garage, surrounded by sawdust and classical music. Rourke developed a theory. He suggested the killer was using some kind of directed energy weapon, something experimental, something that could stop a heart without leaving marks. Chun considered this but found it unlikely. Directed energy weapons were not commercially available, and there was no evidence of any organization or individual in the area with access to such technology. They were pursuing every angle, but the case was becoming national news. The press called him the routine killer. Headlines screamed about a serial murderer who could kill without leaving evidence. People began to change their habits, to vary their schedules, to break their routines out of fear. But Chun knew this would not help. The killer was not targeting randomness. The killer was targeting pattern, and pattern was inevitable. Everyone had routines, even if they tried to hide them. The 5th victim was discovered on a Friday evening. Linda Park, 28, nurse, found by her roommate. Linda was sitting on her couch, wearing yoga clothes, water bottle beside her, yoga mat unrolled on the floor in front of her. A laptop was open on the coffee table, paused on a yoga instruction video. Linda did yoga every Friday evening at 7, never missed it. The scene was perfect. Her position on the couch suggested she had been about to start, about to stand and step onto the mat. The video was paused at the introduction, 0 minutes and 12 seconds. The water bottle was full. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. Everything was ready, except Linda Park was dead. Chun photographed the scene with growing dread. 5 victims, no connections except routine, no physical evidence except precision. She measured the distance from the couch to the yoga mat, noted the brand of water bottle, the title of the yoga video, the position of Linda's hands in her lap. She interviewed the roommate, who was distraught, confused, terrified. The roommate confirmed Linda's Friday routine, said Linda was looking forward to yoga, had been talking about trying a new advanced class. Chun returned to the station and spread all the photographs across her desk. 5 scenes, 5 victims, 5 routines, perfectly preserved. She stared at them until her vision blurred, looking for something she had missed, some detail that would make sense of this nightmare. Rourke joined her, brought coffee, sat in silence. After an hour, he spoke. He said the killer was not leaving evidence because the killer was not touching the victims. He was not poisoning them, not attacking them, not even entering their homes in the traditional sense. The killer was observing, documenting, learning, and then somehow triggering death at the exact moment when the routine was most vulnerable. But how, Chin asked. How do you kill someone without touching them? Rourke did not have an answer. Chun began to investigate the victims' medical histories more thoroughly. She requested brain scans, genetic tests, anything that might reveal a commonality. The results showed nothing unusual. Different blood types, different genetic markers, no shared medical conditions. The only thing they had in common was routine. Chun interviewed a psychiatrist who specialized in behavioral patterns. The psychiatrist explained that routines provide comfort, structure, predictability. They reduce anxiety, create a sense of control. But routines also make people vulnerable because they become automatic, unconscious. When you perform a routine, you stop paying attention. You relax. You trust that everything will proceed as it always has. And that trust, the psychiatrist said, can be exploited. Chin asked how. The psychiatrist paused, then suggested that fear itself could be a weapon. If someone believed they were going to die during a specific routine, the stress and terror could potentially trigger a fatal cardiac event. But Chun knew this was not the answer. The victims showed no signs of fear. Their faces were peaceful, bodies relaxed. They had not known they were dying. The 6th victim changed everything. Professor Martin Reeves, 54, history professor at the local university. Found in his office on a Tuesday morning by a graduate student. Martin was sitting at his desk, fountain pen in hand, grading papers. A red leather notebook was open in front of him, pages filled with meticulous notes. His office was exactly as colleagues described it, organized but cluttered, books stacked on every surface, papers arranged in careful piles. Martin graded papers every Tuesday morning from 8 to 10, before his first class. It was a routine he had maintained for 20 years. But when Chin examined the scene, she found something different. The notebook was not a grading book. It was a journal, and the last entry, written in Martin Reeves's distinctive handwriting, was dated the morning of his death. Chun read the entry carefully, photographed every page, then read it again. Martin had written about feeling watched, about noticing the same car parked across from his house on multiple occasions, about seeing someone in the university library who seemed to be observing him. He had written about his routines, listing them with dates and times, as if trying to understand why someone would be interested in his predictable life. The final sentence read, "I think I know what he wants, and I cannot stop it, because to stop it would mean stopping myself." Chun felt a chill run down her spine. Martin Reeves had known. He had understood that he was being watched, that his routines were being documented, and he had known that changing those routines would not save him because the routines were not just habits, they were identity. To stop grading papers on Tuesday mornings would mean becoming someone else, and Martin Reeves could not do that. The killer understood this. The killer was not just documenting routines, he was weaponizing identity itself. Chun called an emergency meeting with Rourke and the department captain. She presented her findings, explained the pattern, showed them Martin Reeves's journal. The captain asked if they could warn the public, tell people to change their routines, vary their schedules. Chun said it would not matter. The killer was choosing victims who were psychologically incapable of changing, people for whom routine was not just comfort but essence. Breaking the routine would break the person, and the killer knew this. Rourke asked the obvious question. If the killer is not using poison or weapons or physical force, how is he actually killing them? Chun had been thinking about this constantly. She had consulted with cardiologists, neurologists, psychologists. She had researched rare medical conditions, obscure toxins, experimental technologies. And she had arrived at a conclusion that she knew sounded impossible. She told them that the killer was not killing the victims in the traditional sense. The killer was creating conditions so precise, so perfectly aligned with the victim's expectations, that the victim's own body shut down. A kind of psychosomatic death, triggered by the absolute certainty that this moment, this routine, this familiar action was the last. But no one can think themselves to death, the captain said. Chun said that was not entirely true. There were documented cases of voodoo death, where people who believed they were cursed died without physical cause. There were cases of broken heart syndrome, where extreme emotional stress caused fatal cardiac events. The human body was capable of shutting down when the mind believed death was inevitable. The killer, Chin explained, was somehow communicating to the victims that they were going to die, not through threats or violence, but through the perfection of the scene itself. By recreating their routine with absolute precision, by demonstrating complete knowledge of their lives, the killer was sending a message that could not be misunderstood. I know you. I know everything. And this is where it ends. The captain rejected this theory as speculation, but authorized Chun to continue investigating. Rourke was more receptive, said it made as much sense as anything else in this impossible case. They returned to the evidence, looking for how the killer could communicate this message. Chun examined the objects in each scene. The coffee cup, positioned exactly. The television remote, thumb on the pause button. The yoga mat, ready but unused. The birdhouse, finished. She realized that the objects were not just arranged, they were completed. The killer was finishing the routines, demonstrating that he knew not just what the victims did, but when they would stop doing it. The seventh victim was found on a Sunday evening. Rachel Kim, 39, software engineer, discovered by her husband when he returned from a business trip. Rachel was sitting at her kitchen counter, laptop open, cup of green tea beside her, coding. She worked on personal projects every Sunday evening, a routine her husband called her creative time. The code on her screen was complete, a personal app she had been developing for months. The final line had been written, the program compiled, the project finished. Rachel Kim was dead, slumped over her keyboard, and her last project was done. Chun and Rourke arrived at the scene together. Chun photographed everything while Rourke interviewed the husband. The husband was devastated, confused, kept saying Rachel had been so excited about finishing the app. She had been working on it for months. It was almost ready for release. Chun examined the laptop screen. The code was elegant, efficient, exactly the kind of work Rachel was known for. But the final commit message, the note that programmers leave when saving their work, was not in Rachel's style. It read, "This is where we stop." Chun showed this to Rourke. He stared at it for a long moment, then said the killer had access to the laptop. He had been watching Rachel code, had seen the project develop, had waited until it was nearly complete, and then had finished it himself, adding that final message. But how did he access the laptop? Chun asked. Rachel's husband confirmed the computer was password protected, biometric login, secure. Rourke suggested the killer was a hacker, someone with advanced technical skills. Chun considered this, but it did not explain the other victims. Sharon Mitchell and her crossword. Marcus Webb and his documentary. These were not technical people, their routines were not digital. The killer was not just a hacker. He was something more comprehensive, something more frightening. Chun returned to the station and reviewed every piece of evidence again. She looked at the timeline, the spacing between victims. 2 weeks, then 3 weeks, then 1 week, then 4 days, then 3 days, then 2 days. The killer was accelerating, and the acceleration itself was a pattern. She calculated the next interval. If the pattern held, the next victim would be found tomorrow. Chun put out an alert to all officers, told them to be vigilant, to respond immediately to any calls about unresponsive individuals. She stayed at the station all night, reviewing files, studying photographs, waiting. The call came at 6:15 in the morning. A body found in an apartment downtown. Chun and Rourke rushed to the scene. They climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, entered the apartment, and Chun stopped breathing. The victim was a woman in her late 30s, sitting at a small desk near the window. She was wearing running clothes, had a water bottle beside her, running shoes on the floor. A fitness tracker was on her wrist, showing a route map on its screen. The woman ran every morning at 6:30, same route, same distance, but she had not left for her run. She was sitting at the desk, looking at the route on her tracker, and she was dead. Chun photographed the scene, but her hands were shaking. 8 victims. The pattern was clear now. The killer was documenting routines, learning them perfectly, and then recreating them at the moment of death. But he was also completing them, finishing what the victims could not finish, demonstrating absolute control. The medical examiner arrived, examined the body, shook his head. No visible cause of death. Chun knew what the autopsy would show. Nothing. The 8th victim would be like all the others, unexplainable, impossible. Rourke pulled Chun aside, said they needed to change strategies. They were not going to catch this killer through evidence because he was not leaving evidence. They needed to think like him to understand his motivation. Chan agreed, but she was exhausted, terrified, beginning to doubt everything. That afternoon, Chun received a call from a behavioral analyst at the FBI who had been consulting on the case. The analyst had reviewed all the materials and had developed a profile. The killer, the analyst said, was someone who valued order, precision, routine. Someone who found chaos intolerable. Someone who saw patterns everywhere and needed to control them. The analyst suggested the killer might be someone whose own routine had been disrupted. Someone who had lost structure and was trying to impose it on others. Chun asked if this profile helped narrow down suspects. The analyst said it described approximately 40% of the population. Everyone has routines, everyone values order to some degree. The killer could be anyone. Chun thanked the analyst and hung up, feeling more hopeless than before. She looked at the photographs on her desk, 8 victims, 8 perfect scenes, and she realized something. The killer was not just recreating routines, he was honoring them. The care he took, the precision, the respect for the victims' daily lives, it was almost reverent. He was not destroying their routines, he was preserving them, making them permanent, eternal. It was a horrifying kind of love. That night, Chun could not sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about her own routines. She woke at 5:30 every morning, made coffee, went for a run, showered, dressed, drove to the station. Every day, the same, predictable, observable. She got up, walked to her window, looked out at the street. A car was parked across the road, headlights off. She watched it for 10 minutes. It did not move. Chun felt fear, real fear, for the first time in her career. She grabbed her phone, considered calling for backup, then saw the car drive away. Just a person sitting in their car, nothing unusual. But the fear remained. The killer was out there, watching someone, learning someone's routine, preparing for the next death. And Chun had no idea how to stop him. The 9th victim was discovered the following morning. Officer Maria Santos, 31, found at the police gym. She was sitting on a bench press, weight bar loaded, hands in position, eyes closed. Maria worked out every morning before her shift, same routine, same exercises. She had been about to lift when she died. Chun stood in that gym, surrounded by equipment and mirrors, and felt the investigation collapse around her. The killer had murdered a police officer, someone trained to be observant, someone who understood danger. If Maria Santos could not protect herself, no one could. Rourke suggested they review security footage from the gym. The footage showed Maria entering at 5:45, exactly as she did every morning. She warmed up, stretched, moved to the bench press, loaded the weights, sat down, positioned her hands, and then simply stopped. No one else was in frame. No one approached her. She was alone, and then she was dead. Chun watched the footage dozens of times, looking for anything unusual. There was nothing. Maria had been alone, safe, and still the killer had reached her. Chun requested a meeting with the department captain and the police chief. She told them they were facing something unprecedented. A killer who could murder without physical presence, without evidence, without warning. She said the department needed to bring in federal resources, specialized units, anything that could help. The chief listened, then asked Chun for her professional opinion on what the killer wanted. Chun thought carefully before answering. She said the killer wanted control, but not the kind of control most serial killers wanted. He did not want to dominate through fear or violence. He wanted to demonstrate that life itself was an illusion of control, that everyone's routines were visible, predictable, vulnerable. He wanted to prove that the structure people built around their lives could be used against them. The killer, Chun said, was making a statement about human nature itself. The chief asked if Chun thought the killer would stop. Chun said no, he would continue until he was caught or until he chose to stop, and she did not think he would choose to stop. The pattern was too important to him. The routine of killing had become his own routine. Over the next week, 3 more victims were found. A librarian who read in the same chair every afternoon. A chef who prepped ingredients in the same order every morning. A dog walker who followed the same route every evening. 12 victims total. The city was in panic. People were staying home, refusing to maintain schedules, calling in sick to work. But the killer continued. Chun worked 18-hour days, reviewing evidence, interviewing anyone who might have seen something. She expanded her search to include surveillance from traffic cameras, ATM machines, security systems. She was looking for anyone who appeared multiple times near the victims' locations, anyone who seemed to be watching, documenting. She found dozens of possible suspects, but none led anywhere. Rourke developed a theory about timing. He noticed that each victim was killed at the precise moment when their routine was most established, most comfortable, most unconscious. Sharon Mitchell had filled in 3 crossword answers, entering her flow state. Marcus Webb had paused his documentary at a familiar moment, relaxed and engaged. The killer was striking when the victim's guard was completely down, when they were most themselves. Chun asked how this helped them catch him. Rourke admitted it did not, but it helped understand him. The killer was not interested in struggle or fear. He wanted acceptance, peace, the natural conclusion of a pattern. He was creating deaths that looked like endings, not interruptions. On day 47 of the investigation, Chun received a package at the police station. It was addressed to her, no return address, postmarked locally. Inside was a flash drive. Chun immediately called the tech unit to examine it for malware. The drive was clean, contained a single file, a video. Chun watched the video in a conference room with Rourke and 2 FBI agents who had joined the investigation. The video showed a room, empty, white walls, no furniture. A voice spoke, distorted, unidentifiable. The voice said, "You are looking for patterns, Detective Chun, but you are missing the point. The pattern is not what I do. The pattern is what they do. Every person I have chosen lived with absolute consistency. They built their lives around repetition, comfort, predictability. They were not living, they were existing, following scripts written years ago. I gave them endings. I completed their patterns. I gave them peace." Chun stopped the video, rewound it, listened again. The voice was calm, measured, not threatening, almost kind. The video continued. The voice said, "You have your own routines, detective. You wake at 5:30. You make coffee, French press, 2 scoops. You run 3.7 miles, same route. You shower, dress, drive to the station, arrive at 7:15. Every day, you are as predictable as they were. But I am not going to hurt you, Detective Chun. You are still searching, still changing, still uncertain. You have not settled into the final pattern. Not yet." The video ended. Chun sat in silence, feeling her heart race. The killer knew her routine, had been watching her, documenting her life. But he had also told her she was safe for now because she was still changing, which meant the killer's criteria was not just routine, but acceptance of routine, resignation to it. The FBI agents wanted to trace the package, analyze the video, run voice recognition. Chun knew it would lead nowhere. The killer was too careful, too precise. But the video gave her something else, an insight into his mind. He saw himself as merciful, as someone who was ending suffering, completing stories. He was not motivated by hate or anger. He was motivated by a twisted compassion. Chun returned to her desk and looked at her own life with new eyes. Her routines were not just habits, they were armor, protection against chaos. She had built them after her divorce, after the depression that followed, after the months of uncertainty and fear. The routines had saved her, given her structure when everything else was falling apart. But the killer saw them as weakness, as surrender. Chun made a decision. She would break her routines, force herself into unpredictability. She would prove the killer wrong, show him that structure and change could coexist. But even as she thought this, she knew it was what he wanted. He had told her she was safe because she was still changing. He was encouraging her to break her patterns, which meant he understood that forcing change was itself a form of control. The 13th victim was found on a Sunday morning. Detective James Rourke, 46, discovered in his home office. He was sitting at his desk, case files spread in front of him, coffee cup to his right, reading glasses on. Rourke reviewed case files every Sunday morning, had done so for 15 years. It was how he found patterns others missed, how he solved the impossible cases. Chun received the call and felt her world shatter. She drove to Rourke's house in a state of shock, entered his office, and saw her partner sitting peacefully at his desk, surrounded by the case files for the routine killer investigation. On top of the files was a note, handwritten, not in Rourke's handwriting. It read, "He found the pattern in everything except himself." Chun stared at that note for a long time. Rourke had been so focused on understanding the killer's pattern that he had not seen his own vulnerability. His Sunday morning routine had been his strength, his method, and it had become his death. The funeral was held 3 days later. Chun stood in the cemetery, surrounded by officers and colleagues, and realized she could not continue the investigation. Every lead had failed. Every theory had collapsed. 13 people were dead, and she was no closer to catching the killer than she had been after the first victim. The department assigned new detectives, brought in more federal resources, but Chun knew it would not matter. The killer would continue until he decided to stop, and nothing anyone did would change that. Chun submitted her resignation the following Monday. She could not work in a system that had failed so completely, could not maintain routines that made her a target, could not live with the knowledge that someone was watching, always watching. The captain refused her resignation, said she was the best detective they had, said they needed her. Chun said she needed to leave, and the captain eventually agreed to a leave of absence. Chun left the city. She moved to a small town 200 miles away, rented a cabin in the woods, cut off contact with everyone from her previous life. She stopped making coffee with a French press. She stopped running at the same time every day. She stopped following any predictable pattern. She became chaos, deliberate and exhausting chaos. Months passed. Chun read news reports about the routine killer investigation. More victims were found. The count reached 20, then 25. The FBI took over the case completely. The city implemented curfews, mandatory schedule variations, anything to protect people. But the killer continued, and the routines, even forced routines, continued to be weaponized. Chun lived in her cabin, trying to forget, trying to escape the patterns that had defined her life. But late at night, alone in the woods, she understood something the killer had said. "You are still changing, still uncertain. You have not settled into the final pattern. Not yet." Chun realized she could not run forever. Eventually, she would settle, build new routines, find new structure. It was human nature, and when she did, the killer would know. He was patient. He was watching. He understood that even chaos, sustained long enough, becomes a pattern. On a cold morning in November, Chun woke in her cabin and made coffee. Not French press, but instant, a small rebellion. She sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop, something she had not done in months. She searched for news about the routine killer investigation. 32 victims. The FBI had released a statement saying they were pursuing multiple leads. Chin knew what that meant. They had nothing. She closed the laptop and looked out the window at the forest surrounding her cabin. The trees were bare, winter approaching. She had been here for 6 months, living without routine, without structure, without purpose. And she was exhausted. She understood now what the killer understood. Routine was not just comfort, it was sanity. Without it, life became noise, confusion, endless decision-making. The human brain needed patterns to function, needed repetition to process the world. The killer was right about that, but he was wrong about the conclusion. Routine did not have to be surrender. It could be choice, conscious, and deliberate. Chun made another decision. She would return to the city, return to the department, return to the investigation. But she would do it differently. She would maintain routines, but she would understand them, control them, change them when needed. She would not be a victim of patterns. She would be their master. She packed her belongings, closed up the cabin, and drove back to the city. She met with the captain, who welcomed her back with obvious relief. The investigation had stalled. New detectives had found nothing. The FBI was frustrated. Chun asked to review all the evidence again, every file, every photograph, every interview. The captain agreed. Chun spent weeks rebuilding her understanding of the case. She looked at the 32 victims, studied their routines, analyzed the pattern. And she found something new. The spacing between kills had changed. In the first months, the killer had accelerated, moving from weeks to days between victims. But after Rourke's death, the pattern had shifted. The kills were spaced irregularly, 3 days, then 10 days, then 2 days, then 20 days. The pattern was breaking down. Chun realized the killer was struggling. He had achieved something with Rourke's death, had killed someone who understood him, someone who was searching for him. After that victory, the kills had become less satisfying, less meaningful. The killer was losing his purpose. Chun developed a new theory. The killer needed someone to understand what he was doing, needed someone to see the pattern and appreciate it. He had been communicating all along, through the crime scenes themselves, through the precision and care. He was an artist who needed an audience. And his audience had been the investigators, specifically Chun and Rourke. Now Rourke was dead, and Chun had disappeared. The killer was killing without meaning. Chun decided to give him what he wanted. She wrote an article for the local newspaper, published under her own name. In the article, she described the routine killer's methodology, his precision, his understanding of human nature. She called him intelligent, methodical, patient. She said his crime scenes were works of art in their own way, demonstrations of how deeply he understood his victims. She said she knew he was watching, knew he was listening, and she wanted him to know that she understood what he was trying to say. The article was published on a Friday morning. Chun waited. That evening, she received an email at her department address. The email was from an anonymous account, encrypted, untraceable, contained a single sentence. "You understand what the others do not, but you still think you can stop me." Chun replied, "I do not want to stop you. I want to understand you. Why routine, why pattern, why these specific people?" The response came within minutes. Because routine is the lie we tell ourselves that we have control, that we have chosen our lives. But no one chooses. They follow paths created by others, repeat behaviors learned in childhood, build cages and call them homes. I am showing them the truth. I am completing their circles. Chun typed carefully, but you are also following a pattern, also trapped in routine. You choose victims, document their lives, recreate their scenes. You are as predictable as they are. The response took longer this time. Yes, I am the final pattern, the pattern that ends all patterns. When I finish, everyone will understand that routine itself is death. We die a little every time we repeat ourselves, and I am simply making that death visible. Chun asked the question that had haunted her from the beginning. How do you kill them? There was no response for an hour. Chun waited, knowing the killer was deciding whether to reveal his method. Finally, a new email arrived. I do not kill them, Detective Chen. They kill themselves. I show them the completion of their pattern, the perfect recreation of their routine, and their minds understand that this is the end. The body follows what the mind knows. It is not murder. It is revelation. Chun stared at the screen, understanding and horror flooding through her at the same time. The killer had found a way to communicate inevitability so perfectly that the victim's own consciousness accepted death. The precision of the scenes, the completion of the routines, the absolute demonstration of knowledge, it created a psychological state where the victim simply stopped living, not from fear, but from acceptance. Chun typed a response. If I understand you, if I truly see what you are doing, will you stop? The killer's reply was immediate. No, because now you are part of the pattern. You left and returned. You broke your routines and built new ones. You are still searching, which means your pattern is incomplete. When you stop searching, when you accept that this is your final routine, then you will understand completely. And then you will be at peace like the others. Chun closed her laptop and sat in the dark station, alone. The killer had been right from the beginning. She could not catch him because catching him meant completing her own pattern, accepting that this investigation defined her, that searching was her routine, and that searching would eventually end. And when it ended, she would be vulnerable. Chun understood now why Rourke had died. He had found the answer, had understood the pattern completely, and in that moment of understanding, his routine had completed. The Sunday morning review of case files had led him to the final insight, and that final insight had been his death. Chun would not make the same mistake. She would continue searching, but she would never find the answer, never complete the pattern. She would make the investigation itself infinite, endless, a routine that could not finish. She worked the case for the next 3 years. She followed leads that led nowhere, developed theories she knew were wrong, maintained the appearance of progress without achieving it. She became the detective who would never solve the routine killer case, and in that failure, she found safety. The killer continued to kill, but the spacing between victims grew longer, months instead of days. Chun understood he was waiting for her to give up, to settle into resignation, to complete her pattern. But she would not give him that satisfaction. She would search forever, incomplete and alive. On a Tuesday morning in March, 3 years after she returned to the city, Chun woke at 5:30, made coffee with a French press, went for a 3.7-mile run, showered, dressed, and drove to the station. She arrived at 7:15, sat at her desk, and opened the routine killer case file. She had reviewed it thousands of times, knew every detail, every photograph, every interview. She turned to the first page, a photograph of Sharon Mitchell sitting at her kitchen table, coffee and crossword, peaceful and dead. Chun stared at the photograph and realized she had fallen back into routine. The same wake time, the same coffee, the same run, the same arrival time. The same case file review every Tuesday morning for 3 years. She had not been searching. She had been repeating. Chun felt fear, deep and cold. She looked around the empty station, early morning light coming through the windows, and understood that she had completed her pattern. The investigation was her routine, and she had just realized it was finished. She heard footsteps in the hallway outside her office. Slow, measured, approaching. Chun knew who it was, knew what was coming. She thought about running, about breaking the pattern one final time, but her body would not move. The footsteps stopped outside her door. Chun stared at the photograph of Sharon Mitchell, at the peaceful expression on her face, and understood why the victims had looked so calm. They had known, in those final moments, that their routines were complete, that their patterns were perfect, that there was nothing left but ending. The door opened. Chun did not look up. She sat at her desk, case file open, coffee beside her, and waited for the pattern to complete itself. The person in the doorway did not speak, did not move closer. Chun could feel them watching, documenting this moment, this final routine. A detective at her desk, reviewing a case she could not solve, completing the pattern she had been following for years. Chun thought about her life, about all the routines that had defined it, about the comfort and the prison of repetition. She thought about the killer's words. We die a little every time we repeat ourselves. She understood now that he was right. The door closed softly. Chun sat alone in her office, the case file open in front of her. The same file she had reviewed every Tuesday morning for 3 years. Her coffee was still warm. The station was quiet. Everything was exactly as it should be. And Detective Sarah Chun, 41 years old, closed her eyes and let the pattern end.